Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ann Petrick, Senior Director of Research at Vistage. I'm happy to host the latest webinar in our Peak Performer webinar series. The series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts to the Vistage community, experts who provide exceptional insight and best practices to help you navigate new challenges and possibilities. Now, our latest CEO Confidence Index survey revealed that creating a strong culture is a very important part of the talent management strategy for 67% of CEOs of small and mid-sized businesses. And diversity and inclusion is certainly a critical part of a strong culture. Today, our focus is on making inclusion a part of your organization's culture. We've invited Amy Flynn and Amara Abedi from Insperity to share insights. Amy is a diversity and inclusion consultant with Insperity and helps many small businesses grow and reach their goals. Her experience lies in the areas of diversity and inclusion in the workplace, as well as with overall team and career development. Amy was instrumental in the development of diversity initiatives at Boston College. Amara is an organizational psychologist who has successfully helped various government and private sector agencies, including Houston and Chicago police departments, Gartner, Habitat for Humanity, among others. Amara, would you get us started, please?
Absolutely, with pleasure. This is such an exciting topic for both Amy and I. Amy, would you say that?
Absolutely. We're so excited to be here today. There's so much to talk about and could not be happier to be here. So thank you.
All right, then let's get started. I think this topic is exciting for several reasons, but just the realization that diversity, equity, and inclusion, or as we say, DEI in short, is more than a training and an isolated event or a soft skill has become increasingly critical to the success of any organization. And I know you wouldn't be here if you didn't know or appreciate the importance of this topic, this initiative. But I still want to go over just a quick few facts to talk about not just how important this topic, not just the importance of this topic, but also how important it is. There was a study done by Deloitte and the author of this book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader, Jennifer Brown, in 2018. And in that study, they reported that 61% of employees feel that they need to cover the key elements of who they are because they fear negative stereotypes in the workplace. And nearly 50%, which is half of the LGBTQ community employees, remain closeted into the workplace. I'll take a moment to emphasize 61% of employees feeling that they cannot be who they are. They cannot show their personality. They cannot feel to have that trust in the workplace where they can be themselves. That's a very big and heartbreaking number to know that there are so many people who spend at least a third part of their day in an environment where they do not feel or believe that they can show their true identity. And this has to be both. I can't imagine how mentally and emotionally exhausting and discouraging it must feel for them. So if you're attending or listening to a recording of this webinar, it is highly probable that you already understand the importance, like I said, of having an inclusive workplace. It is also highly probable that although you understand the importance, you might not be sure exactly how to infuse inclusion in your workplace. But no fear, because our goal today is to help you with the how. With that said, so we're going to get started with the agenda. Some of the topics that we have put together, I know inclusion is such a simple term, like if you think of it from just an English language perspective, we all understand what it means. But from the perspective of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're going to break it down for you to exactly what that means, just to level the playing field. And then we will discuss the actual tactical strategies as well as some of the intangible actions that you can take to start incorporating this into the culture of your organization, into the business strategy that you have in place or you're planning to have in place for your company. With that said, we will also take a look at what does it mean if you have a non-inclusive organization. How can that hurt your culture? How would that make your employees feel excluded? We have this quote from our Director of EEO and DEI Services here at Insperity, Aisha Tompkins. And I personally love this quote because, as it says, undoubtedly, diversity, equity, and inclusion make for better operated businesses and employee satisfaction. It covers two main areas of UC: better operated businesses and employee satisfaction. Those are the two biggest parts of your company. If your employees are satisfied, if your employees are happy, there is a very high chance that that will cause for your business to run better, grow faster, make more money. To start, let's get started with defining what is inclusion. I know we're all talking about it. I'm sure you've heard it from so many different sources and it's all over the internet, LinkedIn, social media, everywhere. But what does it truly mean? Countless organizations right now are diligently working and seeking expert assistance to gain a better understanding of what it truly means to have an inclusive work environment and how to go about creating one. Like I said, a simple Google search will give you so many different explanations and metaphors to define inclusion and how to create one, but which approach do you take? Which approach do you feel is the best one to include? So here we have three different terms that will just break it down in a very simple manner for you, and that tends to give you that comprehensive explanation of what we mean when we say inclusion: acknowledgement, acceptance, and appreciation. When we are truly inclusive, we acknowledge the different experiences and characteristics of others. We all want to be acknowledged and feel comfortable knowing that others can and will acknowledge us in the totality of our existence. Acknowledging the demographical differences, inherent and acquired characteristics. What I mean by that is inherent are, the things that you're born with, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, and age at times, right? So, and acquired characteristics are things that your socioeconomic class or other experiences, backgrounds, customs. So looking at those and how accepted, how acknowledged you feel of your total existence, that gives you that idea of feeling acknowledged in your workplace. The second A, which is acceptance, now that's a little more self-explanatory. To be inclusive simply means to accept the differences of others. So first, you acknowledge them, that there are differences. Second, you accept those differences of others. When we are truly accepting of others, we accept that their backgrounds and experiences are different than those of our own, and consequently shape their perspectives, opinions, and behaviors differently than ours. We accept individuals for who they are without the expectation or requirement of conformity to our way of thinking, behavior, or status quo. Similar to the need to acknowledge individuals in the totality of their existence, to be truly accepting also means to allow individuals to be their true, full, and authentic self. The third A is the appreciation. So first we acknowledge, then we accept, and now the third A is appreciation of those differences is the last component of being inclusive. The appreciation of differences is evidenced by the value that is placed on creativity, innovation, new perspectives, and cultural competency that can only be achieved when diversity and inclusion are both present. Because diversity merely speaks to the representation, but in itself, it does not yield creativity, innovation, and new perspectives or cultural competency. So to accomplish these things, diverse individuals must be allowed to actually contribute provide input, and have a voice. So it is only in an inclusive environment that this can occur. And when this occurs, the invaluable concepts of creativity, innovation, new perspectives, cultural competency, they can actually be increased. Amy, when you are talking in the field to our clients and to our partners, do you have a different way of describing inclusion to them? I know the concept, when I get asked questions on this is such, like, it can be perceived as a subjective idea, hard to be measured, and then sometimes hard to even explain, because diversity is so much easier to explain. How do you define inclusion?
It's such a good question, because it really is one of those things that you can't always put your finger on it, right? It's a feeling that people have, individuals have, our employees may or may not feel inclusion within an organization. And it's not always something that we can easily measure in the same way that we measure a lot of what we do, right? So it's really being able to get a sense of how do people feel? Do they feel like they belong in the organization? If they're asked these questions, if they're surveyed, for example, and they say, well, how do I, how do you feel like you're valued in this organization? Do you feel like you belong? What are those responses to that? And it can be really eye-opening, I think. I think that, there may be times when leaders and organizations may think that, oh, well, everyone must feel, that they belong, or that I would assume that they would, but it's not always the case, right? So being able to ask and really get some feedback, I think, is really, really important here, because it's not always something we can easily put our finger to and be able to understand just at first glance.
I love that. I love that. And to give it a little bit more clarity, because I know diversity was a more popular term before inclusion came around. And so one of the more popular analogies that I think I heard Verna Myers saying, that diversity is being invited to the party while inclusion is being asked to dance while at the party. And many say that the word inclusion can be used interchangeably with the word belonging, like you said. I believe that inclusion involves, like, we talked about acceptance, acknowledgement, and appreciation of diverse characteristics. Inclusion means that you have accepted me into your organization. You have acknowledged my presence and my differences. People want to be able to be accepted and acknowledged for their totality of being, to include their color, their race, their gender, their ethnicity. And then the last A of inclusion, like I mentioned, it's appreciation of those diverse characteristics. Are a person's diverse characteristics appreciated enough to allow them an opportunity for hire, for promotion, or any other key decision-making positions? So while inclusion speaks to acceptance, acknowledgement, and appreciation, diversity merely speaks to representation and numbers. Like we talked about, that it is a little bit easier to measure diversity. It's easier to check the box because it's a numbers game. Inclusion, on the other hand, that's your magic sauce, and that's not as easily achieved or measured. It's possible to be diverse and not inclusive, because you can have a diverse workforce, but your diverse staff may not feel accepted, acknowledged, or appreciated. But it is impossible to be inclusive without being diverse. You have to have a diverse staff before you can include them. So remember, the last A in our definition of inclusion stands for appreciation of diverse characteristics. We cannot be inclusive without the presence of diverse characteristics. And to make it a little bit easier, on this slide, you will see this is more like a conversation. So if you have multiple people in the room, you will see that, let's say, if diversity is a person. And this concept, by the way, I think this was introduced by the professor at Bowling Green State University, and what was the name? Dafina Stewart. And I really like the question that they proposed for all of us to ponder as we seek additional clarity on how to view diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if you see, Stewart says, the diversity would ask, who is in the room? Equality would respond, did everyone know about the meeting in this room? Equity would then ask, who is trying to get in the room but doesn't even have access? And then inclusion would respond, has everyone's ideas been heard? Organizations should be able to respond to each of these questions with an answer reflective of inclusivity. That's how you find out that how your people are feeling, and not necessarily like what's your perception of them feeling included. Amy, do you have any thoughts on this one before we go into how do we actually infuse inclusion into our overall business strategy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting because I think oftentimes when I'm working with organizations, they'll come to us and say, we want to do more with DE&I, and we, really making a commitment. And so we want to start with diversity. We want to look at our recruiting, and we want to think about, who's in the room, because this is really important. It's critical, and it is, right? It's very important that we have representation kind of across the board, right? But that's usually, interestingly, the starting point and the start of the conversation. And then once we start talking some more, it's really looking at the layers within that and thinking about, well, what are we really looking at? And we want to also be paying close attention to inclusion, because if we're recruiting, diverse workforce and bringing some amazing people into this room, what's happening then, right? What is their experience going to be, and how do they feel about being in that room? And so making sure that we're addressing that and being able to put into place, some real support and some real response and on the front end, so that everyone who enters into your organization feels valued and feels, equally respected and that they belong. So, which kind of leads into, this bigger question of infusing inclusion into your overall business strategy. As business owners and leaders, thinking about, what are your responsibilities in diversity and inclusion? This is a big question. It truly, truly does, from my perspective, and seeing many different D&I strategies being talked about right now, it really does need to be a priority for leaders. So it can't just be an afterthought or something that we're thinking about in the moment. Obviously this past year has been one like none of us have ever experienced on any level, I would say. But recent events in our country, and social unrest have created more awareness and I think a sense of urgency for a lot of you to want to do more in the area of diversity and inclusion. So the hope is that it really is, you're thinking about the long term and realizing, okay, that this is a marathon and it's not a sprint, right? It really isn't something that we're going to be looking at and making some changes and quickly moving through and then it's done. This is something that we are all in together for the long haul, which is exciting, and there's a lot of opportunity there for sure. And again, just from my experience working with organizations, we found that the companies that have had that support from the top, from their senior leaders or CEOs, CFOs, or C-suite, are the companies that tend to really move the needle in DE&I. It's so important that employees hear that this is a priority, that this is a commitment from senior leaders, because that's, when we were thinking about, what are our goals and how are we communicating what our goals are for the organization. If DE&I is lifted and, to the level of being an organizational goal, people are really understanding that differently. So many of you are in a great spot to be able to really impact and really influence here for sure. And in different ways. So I mentioned the recruiting and hiring and onboarding, and that's a big topic and for good reason, right? And we talked about the need for representation. And in order to have inclusion, again, diversity must be present, right? Inclusion really requires that there's a diverse representation of people, so that those A's, acknowledgement, acceptance, and appreciation of all types of people truly can occur, And recruiting with diversity in mind, it does not mean that hiring decisions are based on demographics of candidates. It doesn't mean that hires should still be made based on the most qualified candidates. It's important to have the most qualified people hired. Recruiting with diversity in mind really means that the places where an organization, where you're sourcing, where you're looking for candidates, hopefully is going to allow for a diverse group of candidates to be identified and found, and that the message about the jobs and the opportunities that you have are reaching the most amount of people, right? So companies, and organizations who I think are make the claim that they can't find qualified, diverse candidates, maybe we're not, looking in all the right places, or we're not widening the net really enough to be able to find these great candidates. And companies who I think have found success here, in diversity and inclusion efforts, have done so because they've built it in to their work. It's something that's been intentional, and it's been a requirement for recruiters and hiring managers to recruit with diversity in mind in their sourcing, and have even tied performance and compensation goals to their DE&I efforts here. Even for those of you who like studies and research like I do, there's a recent study completed by Calvert Investments, survey of corporate diversity practices of the S&P 100, did reveal that 42% of companies in Standard & Poor's 100 index tied executive compensation to diversity goals, which is really interesting, right? So it's again really putting your money where your mouth is and saying this is important, and we are really we're going to measure this, and we're going to be accountable for this. So, when we're thinking about hiring and interviewing, many hiring managers won't begin the interview process until you have a diverse candidate pool presented, so that you can have a diverse pool to select from. And as business owners, leaders, thinking about ensuring that your branding as well showcases diversity and that it's authentic, right? I think that it can be difficult when branding is, or websites and marketing is kind of tells a story and shows some photos and pictures, but it may not represent the true inclusion that's going on within. So thinking, does your marketing strategy reflect your diversity efforts and commitments? Is your communication reflecting that? We could talk with many, leaders of organizations who are saying, we're doing all this great work, but people don't really know. Now that I think about it, our staff doesn't really know the great work that we've been doing and all of the work that's going on kind of behind the scenes. We haven't really shared that yet. And we'll talk more about that, but I think that, the communication here is obviously very critical as well, whether it's through marketing and through our visual, as well as what we're saying and how we're talking about diversity inclusion is really critical. And more and more companies are holding one another. I'm sure many of you are well aware that many organizations are really holding each other accountable for this. And when we're thinking about vendors and suppliers and business-to-business relationships and so on, we're hearing more and more from clients who are saying, our vendor is asking us what we're doing with DE&I in this space, or they're wondering if we've done a survey of our employees. So we have to report this for this grant that we're writing. Our investors are inquiring and so on. So I think we're holding one another accountable in a way that we have never before. And again, there's so much opportunity there, and for all of us to kind of grow as organizations. So even we're thinking about succession planning and promotion and really thinking about inclusion and how that's being built into our overall business strategy. I had a conversation yesterday with an organization, and we were talking about promotion. It came up in the survey that employees felt that promotion opportunities were not truly inclusive, and that perhaps people were being promoted for reasons that were unclear. Right. So we talked about how to take what they have, look at the way that promotions are happening, and to really, really make some changes that were going to be inclusive of all people. So being able to, look at the process and how promotions are happening, how jobs are being posted, what the conversations are leading up to promotion, including career development, can be really, really critical in here as well. And then also corporate and social responsibility. So thinking about who are your partners? What is the work that you're doing in your community? I was talking with an organization. It was a synagogue, and they were talking about doing some work and partnering with some Black churches in their area. And what a great partnership that was, and how that was able to show again ways that they were working within their community and being very inclusive and learning from one another, and just a kind of a great experience overall. So thinking about those partnerships and what is the opportunity there for you to be more inclusive?
I love that. And we are receiving such great questions. Amy, I know we're going to take it at the end. Anne's going to help us answer those. There is one that I feel like leads us so well into our next topic. The question talks about what's the interplay between inclusion and let me go back and read exactly how it was said, belonging. So how do you think about the interplay of inclusion and belonging? And I'm so glad that you asked that question. I was actually sharing this before this webinar. This morning, I read an article on Harvard Business Review, and the difference that you can say, or the interplay between these two terms, inclusion and belonging, is that it's at two different levels. So when it comes to the organization as a whole, inclusion should, this is again Harvard Business Review, okay? No, don't quote me on my thoughts. So, but I really liked how they explained these two terms. They said, when it comes to the organization as a whole, inclusion should absolutely focus on different social groups and increasing representation. But when it comes to the day-to-day, inclusion efforts should be focused more on the individual than the social group that they represent. And the quote that they said, I loved it. I wrote it down here on my paper. It says, people want their social group to be included and their individual self to belong.
That's it. That's it.
I absolutely loved the way like they differentiated both, right? When I'm having a conversation with someone, or if, let's say, in an organization, if a manager is asking their employee, they should be focusing on that individual and not the group that they represent, not the social group that individual represents. But when you're implementing any of these programs in recruiting, marketing, business development, that's when you want to make sure that every social class, that every social group, races, genders, they're all included. Well, when it comes to individual, try finding out what is special about that individual, what is different about who they are, what are the individual differences that they feel to be included. If they look at their job experiences, right? If they have traveled elsewhere, what are they bringing to the table? What is their education? Try including them on that individual level. But again, when you're creating these policies as a business leader and implementing programs, that's when you want to have inclusion. Sorry, Amy, I interrupted you.
No, not
that
at all.
Was just such a good question, and
it is. That was absolutely perfect. Great. So we can talk some more about some tactical strategies and what that could look like, right? So, hopefully when DE and I are woven into the fabric of your company, you create a more universal workplace, right? So the effect and the result there is I'm going to be a more engaged workforce, which then leads right to the bottom line, greater productivity and profitability. It's a lot of research, again, that really looks to that as well. So we're going to kind of move into looking at some of these, again, more tangible ways of how we can infuse inclusion into the workplace. And I think I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but a DE&I survey is really a wonderful place to start because of the fact that number one, it's an act of inclusion in and of itself, right? So by asking people for their thoughts and their anonymous thoughts, that's key as well. We're valuing people's opinion. We are saying we want to know, we want to hear from you, and it is so important that we're going to do survey and we're going to take this information and we're going to move on it. Okay, so the data that you're able to really gain from a survey can be very telling. You're able to learn more about your strengths as an organization, and also about obviously the room for opportunity in here as well. So running a pulse survey is something that I know I work with a lot of our organizations on, and it can be a lot. When you're getting the survey results back, you want to make sure that you are in a position where you are ready to execute. I think that when surveys are done and they're tucked away, and we go as far as to ask people to share, and really be able to go through something that can be emotional for employees to do. We want to make sure that we are able to follow through and to demonstrate that commitment, because otherwise it can really be detrimental, as you can imagine. But lots of really strong information in it. That's where you can get a sense of that inclusion piece of how people feel, and if they feel that they do belong, and if they're valued, which we are unable to get oftentimes in other ways, right? So also thinking about inclusion, training and development, which is, again, can be ongoing. It can be something that you introduce at different points, but something that is ongoing, and talking about diversity and inclusion and making sure that everyone is aware of, again, the language and the concepts and what that looks like, and how to be more inclusive with one another, even, how to invite someone that is in a meeting with you every week who never speaks, inviting them to participate, right, in whatever form that they feel comfortable. And I think the training and development is really important here as well. Another strategy I think that can be something to consider if you haven't yet is the formulation of a DE&I committee and council, task force, with lots of different names for it. The idea really is that it's helping you to identify and develop an action plan to build or to improve your inclusion. And this can be something that, again, as senior leaders, you're able to introduce and to invite people to participate. I've worked with organizations that have a core committee, and then they have subcommittees. So people who are working on recruiting, on education, thinking about their position within the industry, or whatever it might be. So there could be subcommittees, but really, the goal is to be able to have multiple people in the organization across functions, and also from representing different levels of the organization. Again, someone from the C-suite, it's great if they're a part of this, and again, championing a DE&I committee, because that goes a long way, again, in sending the message that this is something that we're really prioritizing here as well. So again, the formulation of I think a committee is a good start, because it can also, I think, how it is when people get together and they're able to think creatively, knowing your culture and knowing what are some ideas that could be great ideas for moving closer toward increased inclusion here as well. Okay. So then we're looking at, things like unbiased merit system, making sure that you have a system of merit where as we talked about, this promotions are made purely based on the performance of an individual. So no, eliminating favoritism, bias, or just arbitrary decision-making in promotion as well. Business resource groups, otherwise known as ERGs, employee resource groups, affinity groups, all can be very helpful. They're voluntary groups, of employees that may share the same demographics, interests, experiences, who join to really provide professional and personal support to each other. And they're formed, to serve as a liaison, hopefully between the group and the leadership. So while each ERG is comprised, it may be mainly of individuals with similar demographics, everyone is welcome and everyone is invited to be an ally of these groups as well. So some of the ones that we've, worked with are, a disability business resource group or a Muslim business resource group, young professionals, women's, Asian business resource group, so on, the list goes on. But they're more effective, obviously, when it's clear members are volunteers. So this is not something that is a part of, someone's job per se. It's a volunteer, and when leadership is obviously very supportive of its existence. So, and then also some other, tactical strategies are thinking about the use of pronouns and email signatures, right? So, really supporting employees who to use preferred, gender pronouns in their email signatures, and that can reduce the misgendering of employees and reduces assumptions made really as to how individuals want to be addressed. It's really clear. And it's a great step in creating an inclusive work environment, especially for our LGBTQ plus community, for sure. And then the gender neutral restrooms, if that's, a possibility, to consider having single-use gender neutral restrooms, in addition to maybe the more traditional men and women restrooms that are probably present in your facility. So, if it's an option, if it's not an option, enhancing the privacy of your restrooms by, adding some flaps to cover gaps on stall walls or doors, and that it may extend as well. So these are all some more tactical, actual actions that, we could be taking or considering here for sure.
Amy, those I love those because they give you some direct application methods and tools that you can take today and then start to consider and implement, like you said, going into the workforce after this webinar. So those are great strategies. Before we move into the impact that those strategies create, those tactical strategies into creating an inclusive organization, I want to learn a little bit about what are the effects of having a non-inclusive organization? What about the negative impacts that if you don't have inclusion in place, how can that actually hurt you at times, right? So I know we've talked so much about the creativity, the innovation that you would miss out on if you have a homogeneous work environment. I think it was George Patton, I really like the quote, how he said that if everyone is thinking alike, then someone is not thinking. So when you have that idea of that concept of groupthink implemented and people are just agreeing with each other for that can get you, that can again that can help make you miss out on so many different areas, and just accepting status quo as it is and not actually being able to challenge or appreciate the diversity of thought in the room, which again can only happen if you have a diverse environment, if you are including diverse characteristics from those individuals. And I can't imagine the potential legal risks that sometimes come with if you're not including based on merit to, people that should be included in those decision makings or in those hiring practices, promoting or having business to business relationships with. I remember this one time, and this was such a long time ago. I think I was still in college at that time. I remember going for an interview. It was for a startup, and my role was to manage relationship with different vendors for the startup. And as I'm interviewing in the room, after they're asking me all these questions, and then at the end of the interview, they told me that you're too pretty for this job. this is a blue collar industry, and it could be distracting for our vendors to have someone in this role like you. I like that, and during that interview, like it felt like I was still so naive. I was still so young that, you know, I didn't know that this kind of decision from a hiring perspective comes with their potential legal risks and liabilities, right? So I didn't pursue anything like that, but it did leave such a strong impression in my mind that after that event, like several interviews, I would question myself. Should I do my hair? Should I like even put makeup on? Should I, like, those things really created that impact as a person in my mind going forward. I don't know if there's something that, Amy, like you have experienced or you see happening with the organizations that you help.
Yeah. I mean, all the time, honestly. And you know, just the other day, I was in a training. I was working with a group, a great group. And as part of this, we talked about bias, and we talked about hidden bias, and how as human beings, we all have bias, right? We just, from the nature of living in this world. And the employees went into their breakout sessions on Zoom, and they were talking about their hidden bias assessment that they had just done. And they came back, and two of the employees were talking in the breakout, and this one guy, his name was Joe. Well, not really, but I'm changing the name. He had said, you know, when we got into the breakout, I was remembering a conversation that I had with Monique when she first started here. And I said to her, I asked her, meanwhile, Monique is Asian American. And he said to Monique, oh, so where are you from? And she said, oh, I'm from Massachusetts. And he said, oh, how do you like living in America? And she was taken aback because she said, I've grown up in Massachusetts. I am an American. And they had that conversation, and it stuck with him for a long time. And he realized, you know, that his bias had crept in when he asked that question. And when they came back, they were in the session, the breakout room, and he said, you know what, I am sorry, I didn't, you know, realize how much of a bias that, you know, had come across there. And they kind of talked about it, and it was something when they came back that it was really powerful, because he had said, you know, I'm glad I had this opportunity to be able to do this, to be able to share this, to learn about this, and so on. But think about that, like that, who knows how long, you know, he might be worried about that, and how long she may be thinking, I can't, you know, why did he say that to me? That could impact their ability to work together, their productivity, and so on. So the impacts can be widespread, and even in places where we may not even, you know, realize. I mean, I'm sure many of the people on that call didn't know that conversation even took place at the time, right? Yeah.
And while having a diverse workforce is great, having a diverse and inclusive workforce is phenomenal. And you know why? Because as you see, employee engagement can be high employee productivity. Some of these areas that impact your bottom line directly, they can have a direct correlation with you having an inclusive organization. Sometimes when you feel that your employees aren't happy, or they're not having a strong employee morale, that can, like I said, you know, it affects their creativity, it affects them taking an innovative approach, not feeling psychological safety in the work environment, or being able to feel that they actually belong in that organization. Some of the intangible actions are a little bit more of a long-term approach. I know we talked about the tactical strategies, the impact of both inclusive and non-inclusive organization. Let's take a briefly look, Amy, if you don't mind, giving us some overview and thoughts on some intangible actions that we can take. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talk a lot about this in our department, and about the need for especially leaders, I think, to really demonstrate what you see up here. So vulnerability and transparency and empathy and humility, it's critical. And, you know, through these actions and through this approach, it really is, it's showing your employees, you know, that kind of human side, right? That I think people are looking to connect with, and which is so critical to be able to see. Brené Brown, I'm sure many of you know the work of Brené Brown, professor, lecturer, famous author of, you might have read Dare to Lead, Daring Greatly, which I love. You know, she's really recognized for her work on the topic of vulnerability. And, you know, she really says that it's the core, it's the heart, right? It's the center of meaningful human experience. And it really is, right? It's, you know, when we're vulnerable, right? It's that feeling that we get during times of uncertainty, when there's risk involved, if something feels uncomfortable, we're not used to maybe having these types of conversations, we're not sure where it's going to go, and we're emotionally exposed, right? So it's the ability to be uncomfortable and allow for that uncertainty and kind of sit with that, right? And if we apply this to, you know, creating this culture of inclusion, then that, you know, means that in order for us to, you know, to create an inclusive work environment, we first must become emotionally vulnerable when we're engaging with others. So it doesn't only mean sharing experiences and thoughts and opinions. It means having the courage and boldness to confront topics, issues, and circumstances, right? So it's creating this culture of inclusion. And being transparent requires that we, you know, allow our true and authentic selves to be exposed. You know, having the ability to be, you know, to really demonstrate our compassion and our empathy with others really can really show, right, our ability to be inclusive as well. And having empathy will prompt us to use our access, our voices of influence and voices of privilege and voice of, you know, being from a dominant group, perhaps, you know, to be a champion or an ally for others who don't, right? And allyship creates a culture of inclusion, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. I know we had a question on allyship as well. If you wanted to give a brief understanding of what that means.
Yeah. So really, it's standing with others, it's being with others, and it's taking a stand. It's being supportive. It can be a question of, you know, I've talked to, you know, colleagues who, you know, after the George Floyd death, and, you know, people would come in and say, did anyone ask about how I'm doing today? Did anyone say, how are you doing today? You know, to our Black colleagues, to all colleagues, but especially, like, I think, you know, in that moment, how are you showing that? How are we demonstrating that? How are we talking and providing space and providing psychological space for one another, right? And sometimes it can be in a more formal way, like through a town hall event or through a facilitated conversation. And sometimes it's through just those one-on-one conversations where we're checking in on each other and we're saying, I care, and I'm with you, and I'm supportive. And just that in and of itself can go a long way. And I know it's a challenge with all of us, with our communication. We're still in the middle. We're not done yet with this pandemic. Unfortunately, we're getting there, right? But oh my goodness. But it still is an issue with our communication. And I think that as a reminder to be intentional, to check in with each other and to support each other, and to, you know, attend events, to, you know, to be knowledgeable, to educate ourselves on, you know, on what is going on, and educating ourselves, so that, for example, people of color aren't the only people who are educating, right? It's not the job of just people of color to be, you know, to share and to educate. It's all of our jobs, right? So
I like that. I like how you said that, because sometimes, even when we have the right intention, depending on how you're communicating it, depending on what your actions look like to the people that you're trying to be more inclusive with, if it's just surface inclusion, if it's just using them to represent the social group that they belong to, it can be perceived that way. It can be transparent, and that can easily backfire. That can easily feel more excluded than being included, that, oh, you're just including me because I belong to a certain group, and not actually for who I am. So I agree with what you said. Some of the final thoughts and resources that we want to leave you today before we answer any questions are, as you think about how implicit biases that we talked about, how they may impact your business, think about the people you serve, the people that you engage with, and the people who spend money for your product or service. Does your company reflect your customer base? Does your company create an environment where innovation and creativity can be maximized to exceed your customers' needs? And lastly, and the most important one, are your employees happy and feel as if they can come to work each day knowing that they are part of an environment where their diverse characteristics are accepted, acknowledged, and appreciated? I truly appreciated our time today, and I'm so glad that I had this opportunity to discuss my thoughts. Here are some other resources. If you have more that you would like to hear about, because we have such limited time here, if you have any other questions that you would like to ask, or any resources, this content, these slides that we can share, we're more than happy if you don't mind emailing us at this address, please. And we will take any questions at this time.
All right. Thank you so much, ladies. That was fascinating. And you answered some of the questions that we had as you were going through the presentation. But I wanted to first talk about recruiting, because there was a series of questions around recruiting and some specific tactics for finding a diverse talent pool. One of the questions that we had was, keeping laws in mind, what job characteristics can you add to maybe a job posting that invites a diverse talent pool? And really, how do you appeal and recruit those diverse candidates? Can you share some best practices around that?
There's a lot that's being said about job descriptions right now. We're looking closely at those. And there are some tools too that can help you to look at your job description. And I know Gender Decoder, for example, is one that's a great one for looking at gender and the language that we're using. And again, who may be attracted to certain job descriptions, or again, who won't apply based on that. The research goes as far as to say, it's fascinating that with men, if it's about a 60% match, again, according to their own assessment of skills and experience, they may apply for a job. But for women and for people of color, it is close to that 100% mark, right? When we think about who is applying. So again, the language does matter, words matter. And so taking a look at that and thinking about what is being said here, what is truly required, right? Oftentimes with job descriptions, it's been something we've used for a long time. We'd kind of maybe dust it off and use it again. When people are taking a closer look, they're finding and saying, you know what, this experience or this skill is something that's nice to have. It's not actually required for this job. And it's been on here for a long time. So if you're thinking about that, it may be that there may be a little bit of bias within that, and you may be excluding some people who may be a good fit for that job based on what you're including or what you're not including. So we're seeing a lot of just sort of, close looks at the descriptions, just to, assess that and make some changes. And it's okay to make changes with this. It's necessary, right? Yeah.
During the interview process, how do you know? I mean, I know some job applications ask for certain characteristics, but how do you know it's a diverse pool before you actually interview? Are there some ways that you can understand your talent pool?
Right. I mean, that's the challenge, right? You want to be very careful that we're not hiring and we're not setting quotas and so on. So really, oftentimes if we think about our sourcing and where those sources are, I'm a big fan of cover letters. I know some people are not a fan of cover letters still, and they're thinking we're just doing resumes and so on. I think the cover letter can tell a lot about someone's, their background, their history, their commitment to diversity as well. And to see what that, what that really looks like. So I think you want to kind of look at the sources and how, potentially how some of the, applications have come through, because it's not, it's not always easy to be able to tell that. It's really not. You can't look at a name necessarily and know how people identify.
It's a double-edged sword.
Yes. Yeah. So it is. It's doing so. That's why the sourcing is so important. And I keep going back to that. But thinking about how can we layer on to what your current recruitment strategy is. It's not saying we have to take everything and, none of it's good or throw it out. It's what are we layering in, and how can we really do, a concerted effort with partnerships with colleges and universities and student organizations and community partnerships to be able to change that pipeline of who's coming through.
Excellent. So I'm going to try and switch. We have a great diversity of questions coming in, and you touched on this a little bit at the end about not making it seem, the question was about making it be pandering or patronizing. So many times these initiatives might come across that way. How do we make sure it's genuine when in the diversity inclusion efforts?
Yes, exactly. Because again, if people feel that this is just something that, it's a check the box kind of activity, then that is real. That's why I do feel that the more information and feedback you can get from your employees about what they want and what is needed, that is so important. I do know sometimes people will start with plans and get going, and that, that's okay. And we want to start somewhere and get going. But there needs to be a time when we are asking for feedback, and we are really saying we want to know what is needed and what you want and what you were going to be responsive, what people can be responsive to, and encourage people, again, either through a committee, task forces, to come together in order to put together the right messages, the right communication, the right activities, the right initiatives, so that people are going to respond. When it's just coming down and it's pushed out, and there hasn't been a lot of, collaboration on that from all levels in the organization, you run the risk of that.
And that's a great answer. I'll add something to that as well, Amy, if you don't mind. So this goes beyond DEI, right? From my personal experiences, professional experiences, I've noticed that when you create trust with an individual at any level, it's so much easier for them to see and not perceive your intentions as that you are patronizing them or you are using them for a certain benefit, because again, because of who they are, or they belong to a certain group. So when you create trust, I think it was Stephen Covey's book that he wrote on how do you create trust in 7 different ways. And one of the biggest one is great listening skills, right? It's not just that you're hearing their concerns or you're hearing them to respond. It's actually to make sure that you're understanding it from their perspective, which again goes back to empathy. How are you creating that trust with that individual and understanding where they're coming from? And creating trust goes, like I said, beyond DEI. That's anytime you want to create any change, trust comes before anything.
Fantastic. Well, I think unfortunately we're out of time for questions. We have some great questions that we've received that we'll share with you, and maybe we can answer some of those offline.
That would be great. We'd be happy to do that. I know.
All right.
Yeah.
That would be great. Well, thank you so much, Amy and Amara. Great conversation, and to our participants, great questions, and we want to make sure that they can answer them as well. So we'll share a recording of this webinar as well as the slides in about 24 hours. And everyone can get deeper insights on this topic at the People and Culture event that Vistage is holding virtually on March 26th. Insperity's Rodney Satterwhite, who's Senior Strategic Consultant from the Mid-Market Group, will be leading this session, sharing some similar insights, so you can get deeper insights by attending that session. So visit vistage.com/events for details on that event and go deeper into this topic. And if you are a Vistage member, watch out for a few upcoming exclusives in our Peak Performer series. Very excited that we have ITR Economics with an exclusive member briefing on March March 19th. And we have lessons from Jim Collins based on his latest book, BE 2.0, in early April. And I've had the opportunity to view those. They're really fantastic. We have some discussion guides designed for chairs as well as for you as members to be able to facilitate conversations with your teams. So that's exciting. And the last thing I'd like to share is we have General Colin Powell coming as part of our Peak Performer series in July. So look out for those communications. Thank you to Insperity. Thanks to our participants, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.